So does anyone remember? I was going to look up two things.
Man.
Oh, money. Yes, that was Gargi's question, right? Let's see here. What was your question actually?
If you have two different,
Can you have
yeah,
two different, okay. I think not, but I think there's something where it's a little, it was interesting. Yeah, actually thank you. I did intend to do this and then I forgot. शुरू करें क्या? Okay, so this is with the reference to Avinash's question about Lahiri. And I don't think I misspoke. What I wasn't remembering was the details. So the point is, there's the base sentence, which I should write here, is John, for the most part, knows who left. Actually, the actual example is who cheated. I just wanted a shorter sentence, but the same idea. This has two readings. Well, one reading is not very salient, two potential reading. One is most of what he knows is this, right? It's not very salient for, with no, but there are other predicates for which you might get that reading. That's where the upstairs reading, most, this is part. I think with most part it's even, so that's not the reading we're interested in anyway. So instead of modifying the verb, what it seems to be doing, this most, is to be modifying who or associating with who. So the reading that's prominent is, let's say 10 people left. He knows for most of them, he knows 8 of them or 6 of them. You could also get it, here's another sentence he had. Remembers. Bill mostly remembers who insulted him when he was not a famous person, or for the most part remembers, or rarely remembers who insulted him. So you have a number of adverbs of quantification that seem to be operating or associating not with expressions in their own class, in their own clause, but with a WH expression that's inside the complement. And this was, these structures, they are known as quantification variability, structures that were looked at by Steve Berman around 1989, and really he basically treated this as a sentence where you had it most directly quantified over individuals. So it was a radically different way of treating questions. What Lahiri's dissertation and then later book and papers did was to say, we can still treat questions the way we were treating them, as sets of propositions, and think about these adverbs differently. We don't have to think about them as only modifying a verb. They can also modify the complement of the verb in the following way. So notice this is a declarative sentence. So the full structure is not interrogative. So IP, you can call it TP if you want. The idea is what you have, so you're treating this complement, the question, as a quantifier, okay? Or as something that has that property. And so what you do is you think of no as taking propositions. And now what you have is something that is a set of propositions. So there's a mismatch. And how do you repair the mismatch? You move this up. You have a set of propositions and you leave behind a phrase that's of propositional type. And what you end up with, and now you have this adverb of quantification, okay? So what the adverb of quantification, the way in which it's going to interpret this structure is the following. This is your normal adverb, this is the adverb of quantification. It quantifies over propositions. Which propositions? Propositions that are potential answers to the question. So this is different from the way I had answered in my system. In his system, any proposition qualifies or subset of propositions qualify, okay, as an answer. So it says, for most P, if P is an answer to Q, i.e. belongs in that set and is true, and P is contextually relevant, this is a general filler we can ignore for present purposes. John knows P. So suppose the case is that the people who left are C left, these are the possible people, right? D left, why not A? There are 4 people in class, so there are 4 possible propositions in here, of which this happens to be true, this happens to be true, this happens to be true. Then this will qualify as true, this sentence, if John knows for at least 2 of them. It could be A and B, or B and C, or A and C. So he knows for at least 2 of them that they left. So now we quantify over 3 propositions, because this D will not pass the restriction that would be an answer to Q. But now we test, is A a proposition such that it's an answer to Q? Yes, it's true and it is in Q. Let's say it's contextually relevant. Does John know P? If we answer yes to this and yes to this, but we happen to say no to this, that's fine, the sentence is true. If he only knows one of them, then it's going to be false, because that's the meaning of most, more than half. So I think to your question, there's one slight difference from the way we have been doing it. this part is the same, it's a proposition. We were treating this as a generalized quantifier, bind with an existential bind of its own. For this structure, what we have to have is this to be just a set of propositions. And most has to bind it. So that's the slight difference. But in terms of what it leaves behind, in terms of the trace, that's similar to if we were to raise it, or when you do WH movement of the something that's just what, like when we were doing in the earlier case, that's the difference. So, but this is not WH movement, right? And so he also adopts Cartoonen. So WH movement is movement of a generalized, existential generalized quantifier, leaving behind a trace which is, if it's over quantifiers, over individuals, then an individual trace bound by a generalized existential quantifier. But this is for structures in which this is just operating as a quantificational term that requires that's an instance of QR. Okay. So that is that. Then the other question was about Gandhi's question whether it's possible to get different values. And I'm glad I remembered to ask, because yes, it is possible. This is a paper by Alan Munn, and the reference is there in my book. So here's a case where you can get different values. So what he says is, typically not, but you can actually, under one condition, you can get this reading, different values for the two WHs. And so I'll just present it to you for your, okay. So where did Mary vacation and Bill decide to live? So the standard one would be Paris. That's where Mary vacationed and Bill decided to live. But he says you could give an answer. Mary vacationed in Paris and Bill decided to live in Toronto. And this goes back to this, how come? If it's the same index, you can't, there's no theory of quantification that will mess with that. So what's the solution? It's something we've actually looked at it somewhat briefly, but let me give you what his take is. So if you quantify over individuals, whether it's places, people, then you're locked into having just the same individual for both. But remember, we talked about functional answers. Engdahl, Kierkegaard, who did every professor recommend? His student. Which book did every author read from? His or her first novel, right? And the actual novel varies, but what they have in common is this relationship. And so he says that's what is going on here, and he'll give independent evidence, but I think it's kind of interesting. So when, this is a slightly gruesome one, which man did Bill kill on Tuesday and Fred kill on Wednesday? Funny it may sound, however, and why is the choice of kill interesting? Well, you can't repeat, you can't kill two people, well, they can simultaneously kill, but that's why he has the Tuesday and Wednesday. So it could not, if it is acceptable, if you can answer this question, then they've got to be different people. So he says, in the answer you can say, Bill killed his first victim and Fred killed his second. Bill killed Bruno and Fred killed Arno. This is all sounding very scary here. So he says, in fact, the data improved considerably if we explicitly mention the function in the WH phrase itself. So which of his victims did John kill on Tuesday and Bill kill on Wednesday? And it becomes beyond, don't look so unhappy. It's just linguistics. So that's his, so the idea is still that you're quantifying over the same thing. It happens to be a choice, not a choice function variable, but a Skolem function, a function from individuals to individual. So if I feed the mother, if I take the mother of function, it's the same function I can apply, I can take, if I take Yangchen as an argument of that function, I'll get one person, Mrs. Roy, is that how she goes?
Chakravarti.
Miss Chakravarti. And if I give Ankana as argument, I'll certainly not get, I think, you're not siblings, right? So, but you get one it's a function because you get a unique output. But you'll get two different outputs. Now I'm not going to say Saha because God, is your mother Mrs. Saha? Or did she go? Okay, Hush Saha. So, but you're getting two different individuals, which we couldn't get if we were quantifying over just women, even the set of mothers in the world. But if you're trying to get to the mothers via their daughters, then we can say her mother, his mother will get potentially different outputs. Two people may end up with the same, but in general, the function allows for that variation. So that's his argument for this. But you always ask when is just a cop out. You say, okay, I'm not quantifying over different people. I'm quantifying over different functions. But here's the argument that makes it an actual explanation or something that one can take seriously. Are there any constraints on functional answers that we know of that also apply to this kind of situation? And that's what he's arguing for. So one difference, one fact that has been noted about functional answers, and this is Kirkia's paper, says, what did everyone bring to the party? Quantifier in subject position, WH in object position. Fronted, no doubt, but WH object, quantifier subject, WH object allows for a fairness treating. The reverse doesn't hold. Who brought every dish to the party? You won't say it's cook or whatever, it's the person who likes it most. So there's a perceived subject-object asymmetry, and one's claim, which I got, is that, so there's an explanation for it which we don't want to go into today, is that the same subject-object asymmetry holds up the possibility of different values in the ATB case. So he says, which man did Bill kill on Tuesday and Fred kill on Wednesday is good. So which man is the object and Bill and Fred are subjects. Yeah. Which man did John murder on Monday and kill on Tuesday? So given the time, I'm not going. Let me see that. Okay, I think this will do it. This is the simplest way. You should read the paper because it's a little bit technical how you derive the subject-object asymmetry. Not so technical that we couldn't do it, but we could have done it 3 days ago, not 1.5. I'll give you the reference 1 second. Let me just give you the data that shows it, I think fairly reasonably. So remember, subject quantifier, object WH allows for functional readings, not the other way around. So we already saw a case, Bill murdered, which man did Bill? So ATB with the object being across the board, right? Here's a case where you would have to have ATB from subject position. Which man murdered Sam and killed Bill? And what you're looking for is his first, the person he convicted in the last trial or whatever, he's the lawyer, he pissed off this person, right? And he killed Sam, and then Bill got killed by the person he pissed off last or something like that, okay? You're not going to, so the reading is not available. Fred murdered Sam and Joe murdered Bill. You can imagine a function that would work. Why you can't get this quantification over functions and these bound with the argument bound from subject position, when the function, the WH is an object is fine, but not when it is a subject. That's the technical part that I don't want to present or not present unless we have time left over. Does that seemed reasonable, and now you wanted the reference, right? It's a nice, very short paper, very nice paper. This is Natural Language Semantics, 1999, 421 to 425. So, yes, the short answer to your question was it is possible, but only in certain configurations, which means that so the second part of the explanation is that individual answers are not affected, right? It doesn't matter whether the quantifier is in subject or an object position. So you can get the uniform answer for both, doesn't matter. So if you're quantifying over individuals directly, subject object doesn't matter. If you're going to quantify over functions, the function better be in object position. Okay. This is the short answer. Believe me, people have argued about this too and found exceptions, but regardless, there's something there. You wanted to have some kind of you needed some time, right? Anyway, I don't think I have that much to say. So let's look at Chavez. Any questions on this one example? You, Swarani, you have a question?
It's not exactly a question. I was just thinking about the kill example. Who did Bill kill on Monday and Fred kill on Wednesday?
Mhm.
But if we elide the word, if we elide the word,
Mhm.
it seems quite ungrammatical. Like who did Bill kill on Monday and Fred on Wednesday?
Mhm.
Then it seems like it is pointing to the same person. Like
Okay.
it is having the
Let's
same.
see. So what did you change? Wait, what did you change?
Like having two different
Which man did Bill kill on Tuesday?
and Fred on Wednesday.
Fred on Wednesday.
Then it seems like we're talking about the same language, the who having only one answer.
Not everybody is agreeing with that. Okay. So the if you felt strongly A, you would have to confirm that this is really not just a kind of preference kind of a thing, but a real hard constraint. You would have to look, and you agree with the other one, the subject-object case, right? Then I think that you would have to look for what are the conditions under which we would delete kill. Something would, that's where I would look for the explanation.
So connected with that, before one, has anybody considered this to be a case of ellipsis, of that you have a different WH and has been divided or something?
So there's I think this was sort of where Srikar started, like, could there be a different chain, two different chains? And I think if there were two different chains, there could be two different functions altogether. Also, if there were two different chains, there may not be the subject-object asymmetry. But I have a feeling this has not been looked at. But what you're saying is basically this, right? That you have conjunction here, and you have two questions, right? Q1 with this, and Q2 with this, right? Both local, and you just add, there's some kind of laziness in not pronouncing the school, but it's really there since they happen to be the same. But then for A, why could you not have this with a different, I suppose you would say you just don't elide it. Who did Bill kill and what did Sue eat? And then you don't elide it. I don't think people have looked at it.
I think in that case, the conjunction is just between the weak things.
No, she is saying maybe, this one lends itself to BP conjunction, what Renuka is suggesting is that maybe the higher structures, under identity, that's what you're eliding. I think that, probably not, it hasn't been looked at, but you wouldn't be able to get the subject-object asymmetry perhaps, if that's really the case. But you never know what will come up if you start looking. So I don't know this literature very well, but this was one that did strike me as, because I had always assumed that it would be the same answer till I read this a few years back. Luckily I remembered it, so take a look at this. I think. Yeah.
So, the reason why WH cannot be across the board when it's a subject, like the
Mhm.
example I had, right? Which man what example? Does it have anything to do with binding?
No. So it can be across the board.
When it's
Which man ate what candy and ate it? Oh no. Which man bought candy and left the store?
oh yeah, okay.
You can get it.
Yeah.
What you can't get is variable
That's what I mean.
readings.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's so.
You can't get a variable reading.
Yeah, that's what. And your
Does
question?
that have anything to do with semantic binding?
So basically, they don't want me to get away without giving the analysis of functional. I can try to do it quickly. How much more is there to do? Okay, now you know what? Let me come back to this. Okay, it's not that complicated. It's just that if I present it and you have a question, I want to be able to spend 5 minutes if I can. Okay, so this should go very fast because when you don't know much, the answers are very short. Okay, go read, go look this up. Here's the reference. So basically, you see the problems with the transformation approach. That's what Chavez talks about. That you can say special things for coordinate structures, but it doesn't fall neatly into the same class of explanations that you have for other transformation within the idea that things move or create chains of a certain type. Something different has to be said for these cases. And then in 4.2, he talks about Gazdar 1981, who actually talked about this kind of semantic identity. And remember, on the first day or something, I talked about how would you derive the kind of question meanings that we are looking at without having a trace. Like, what if your theory of syntax didn't believe in these kinds of derivational dependencies, right? And I mentioned even those theories have some way of recording where the gap is and where the filler is, even if it's not syntactically a trace. And this one, the slash notation that he's talking about, and basically this is how he gets the ATB effect by saying, if you have a transitive verb that doesn't have an object, you have the slash notation, right? It's recording that there's an argument missing. And if you say, I have either two VPs, so if you have a coordinate structure, one side of which, let's say this is a VP coordination, this one has a slash because it's missing an argument. But this one is a VP that's complete, either because it's intransitive or because it has its argument. Then you have this much. This is recording a semantic gap, right? This is another way to think about it is this is of type, it's looking for two arguments. So lambda x, lambda y, eat. This is just looking for one argument left. So lambda, so that's the mismatch. So this has been pretty influential, but then there are other approaches apparently that I don't know so well or at all, but I'm presenting this as a way, go read this stuff, it's kind of interesting. So there are, so Chavez talks about coherence and parallelism, that's how he classifies the third approach to this phenomena. And so so these are more about asymmetric meanings. Okay, I'm going to start below 72. I forget what the relevance of these examples was. But he's drawing on certain people like Taylor and Kuhn, I think, who talked about the relevance of the thing that you've extracted in some sense. And so it says, I do not deny the existence of paratactic pragmatic inferences, but the data suggests that there's some semantic contribution in asymmetric conjunction. So he's arguing for something semantic over and above. So this approach that really looks at coherence relations. And he says there's something to it, but you also have to blend it in with some hardcore semantic distinctions. So according to him, This is not surprising since we can identify many other senses of and or, often accompanied by peculiar syntactic constraints on conjuncts. For example, and can be interpreted as plurality formation, and intensification. Can be in, so plurality formation we all know, Bill and Mary, the boys and the girls, etc. That and is a special meaning that often in many languages, whatever is Boolean and can be co-opted for. Harder and harder, or easier, it gets easier and easier. That cannot be derived through Boolean conjunction. Only arithmetical addition, numeral formation, etc., etc. And he says, I view all these conjunctions, including asymmetric conjunctions like temporal precedence or causal conjunction, as semantically distinct forms of conjunction. So this asymmetric ones, he says, are semantically different. So these are examples, right? A man and a woman who married. Married is a predicate that looks for plurality. So this is just the sound became louder and louder. Let us suppose 2 and 2 is 5, so that's addition. There were 201, so that's, you have to have a, you're adding to 200, you're adding 1. If you say 202, etc., 2 ham rolls and a glass of milk. It was more than Sue wanted. What is this? Packaging, yeah. So that's, okay. So in what follows, I show how the parallel ATP extraction patterns can be obtained as a prediction of Kuno's topicality condition and the semantics of symmetric coordination. I start by proposing a pragmatic predicate RXE. So this R is a variable over some pragmatic condition that requires a filler X must be pragmatically relevant, coherent in the event described by the sister phrase E. So one reason why this caught my eye was because one of the presentations talked about events and some relation between events. I forget which one it was. And so the intended definition of R should be intuitive from the discussion in Kuno, which of course I have not presented to you. However, I propose that R is transitive as defined in 74. So this is the filler head. So filler is the WH that's extracted. He's talking of ATP, he's not talking of the one kind of example, okay? He's talking of ATP being allowed but not, or when you get extraction at all, so. So the filler is the WH, so filler head relevance condition. RXE holds if AX is a coherent argument of event E. So what is left is going to be an event. And is this filler going to be relevant or not? And 2, there is some predicate E and E prime, some predicate that holds of E prime such that R X E prime holds. So I didn't parse all of this. So here's the example he gives in a sentence like who X left. So this is what we spent so many days with lambda and all. We could have just read this. Not have been fine. But this is an approach to WH questions that is somewhat different. This says the constraint RXE can be satisfied if the argument X is relevant for the verb that describes E. So that's the idea. People frequently leave, and so there's nothing incoherent about this example. Conversely, in who do you think left, the condition RXE fails because X is not a relevant argument for think. So you can't think some individual. However, this verb takes E prime as an argument, and therefore the condition RXE prime can be met. So you can see how unbounded dependencies can be approached from this perspective. I'm not endorsing, I'm not saying you could have easily done without the course, what I have taught you. I think those are important things, but it's always good to look at different perspectives. This is a pretty different perspective. Here is the, yes?
The reason why with a thing like why do you think we get an ambiguity because Y can vote for think and then John didn't fix the car. It could be the reason for thinking or the reason
True.
he didn't fix the car.
However, that's true also in the movement account, right? In a standard movement account, what do we say? There are two places where what could have originated from. It's not inconsistent with what this is, right? What this is saying. This is saying we don't need the derivational account per se, but we start with a reason, quantifiable reasons, the filler, and now when we hit think, that's a possibility, but we also allowed to look further down, and then that's another possibility. And then you would have to go through the same, you would have to ask yourself, why do you get weak island effects, etc. And I'm sure they've done it, and in fact, I know that there's literature that tries to get island effects in very different ways. But, so this is, this is just something for you to know and not worry about, but if you start looking at these kinds of phenomena, then remember this, then you can trace your way back. So again, what I'm going to present here is just his take on how you would think about events in ways that kind of reminded me of one of the presentations. So now he says, take the Lincoln of plus operator for creating sums. So we didn't particularly discuss it, but remember when I talked about plurality, I said you have the domain of individuals that have atomic individuals, and then sums thereof using links plus operator. So he's saying you can, and this again is not super radical or anything. People would accept this, I think. In fact, it is used within the event semantics. You do have pluralities of events, so that's what he's going to talk about. He says predicates like smile or happy apply distributively to each member of a plurality. Somebody asked me this question the other day about distributivity. So there are some predicates that are inherently distributive. So even if I say the students are hungry, it's not that the group is hungry, it's that if the group is hungry, then individual members have to be hungry. Hunger is something that groups don't have, that individuals have. So it's an inherently distributive predicate. Some predicates are inherently they're not non-distributive, but they're group predicates. So like be a couple, be a large group, you have to have a bunch of members, but the members of that group are not necessarily large groups, right? So what he's saying is, just like you have predicates that select singular individuals and plural individuals in the argument, you can think of events as being made of either being singular events or pluralities of events. And so plurality formation conjunction can combine daughters of any category. In particular, it can form event pluralities from verbal conjuncts, and here is some reference to people who've done that, including Ling. The sentence in 75A, adapted from Early, describes the frequency of two joint event types, not independent frequencies of occurrence. So this is 75A. Often I go to the beach and you go to the city. So it's not saying each of these things happens often, but the plurality, the coincidence that when I'm at the beach, you take off and go to the city, that's what happens often. And this means you have to have a way, language has to have a way of referring to E1 plus E2. But I think there must be constraints on which, adverbs like simultaneously and alternately apply distributively to event pluralities, while adverbs like often allow distributive and non-distributive readings. So you could have both readings, but you can also think, so the idea is that you have the plurality, and then depending on the predicate, just like in the nominal case, you either distribute down to the individual events or you think of the collection. And now how does he tie this up with what we were discussing, i.e. Extraction out of coordinate islands? So he says, Nominal conjuncts can form a nominal plurality and verbal conjuncts can form an event plurality. When a predicate applies to a plurality, it can either predicate it directly, a non-distributive reading, or extend distributively to its mereological parts, the distributive reading. Okay, that's standard. More formally, a predicate P applying to some argument X can either apply directly as in Px or to its parts, so Px1 and Pxn, etc. Similarly, for symmetric disjunction, you get Px or Pxn is equivalent to Px if x equals x1 or x equals xi. Suppose that R is that I'm just reading this distributes to the conjunct that it applies to. Hence, when R applies to an event sum R x e1 e2, then it must be the case that R x e1 and R x e2 holds. This semantic pragmatic distribution predicts ATB extraction. So I think what he's saying is, remember there are two kinds of, there's symmetric and asymmetric. The symmetric ones are the ones that require ATB. And he said ATB extraction, symmetric ones means they're inherently distributive. So they go down to their parts, and so that is why you get, the same answer to each of them, or the same variable to each of them. It's a case of distributivity modulated by this relation R. So there has to be the same kind of a relevance relation that holds between the whole group event, but also each of its individual parts. So asymmetric coordination meaning cannot force distributivity. So that's more like often I go to the beach and you go to the city, which can either be together or separately. And consequently, R does not have to distribute, thus explaining why ATB extraction is not obligatory. And then there's more explanations. So just because I didn't know this literature earlier, I found it kind of interesting to think of something that I'd always thought of as a direct WH dependency in terms that have to do with distributivity. So I might read. How many of you think you might read this?
Okay.
Alright, then I've done my job. My job was to make you aware, maybe of looking at a different way of looking at it than one might think. Okay, so are there any questions related to this?
Okay, so I'm not sure I got it all completely, but so how does it apply to the kill question? Because kill looks like distributed.
Yeah, so I was thinking that when I was reading this, A, he may not have taken that into account, but B, so the idea was when you can vary, right? And those are across the board extractions. And so when you have across the board, it means it has to distribute down in these terms. And so the relevance would be holding between that function. So I think he would still adopt, he would have to adopt quantification. So the filler would be a filler over functions, mother of function, most recent victim or whatever, not victim, but the person he's supposed. What do you do when you get a contract? So these are killers, right? So I will get my most recent contract. Assignment, yes. So, so I think it would fit in with his idea that this is just has to be distributive, but the variation would have to come, I think, from Skolem, the Skolem function. The coherence relation can make it, should work. But maybe this is a good time to then go back to subject-object asymmetry, because I'm not seeing, again, this is a little bit unfair because I didn't read all the details, right? So it's possible that the syntactic, if they, assuming one is right about the subject-object asymmetry, then there must be something in this distributivity that also controls that, which I'm not sure at this point. But again, assuming that someone who really is pushing this line Also, it's going to look at subject-object asymmetries for quantifier, quantifier, questions with quantifiers, would then apply that here, right? So what one presents is a version of the questions with quantifiers, functional answers to questions with quantifiers that is based very much on Engels semantics, but the syntax is the kind of syntax we have been doing, a movement or one that records has chains at least, or has WH dependencies, and that is due to Kirke. And this is, I won't do it with this example. Let me do it with a simple. So I'll just do this. Who did every professor recommend? And the idea is that this is, of course, could quantify over ordinary individuals, which is what we have been doing so far. But this is actually now going to quantify over scalar functions. So what the end result we want is something like this: lambda p. And I'm going to write capital F, even though in the literature it's done with small f's, but just to keep it separate from choice functions. So they exist in F, and I noted this so just to make it easier to see. So these are functions that are functions from these are student valued functions. So this x doesn't have to do with every professor's. This is C0, right? So this is part of the nucleus. So this says this is a function that ends in students, whose output is student, and I want propositions that are of this form. Every y, Professor y, if y is a professor, then y recommended, that x recommended f of, y recommended f of y. Okay? How does this work? If you think about, let's say we have A and B as professors, and we have C and D as students. There are 4 possible functions: A to C, B to D, F2, A to C, and F3, F to C, and F4, O to D, right? So this could be, let's say, this is the function, the student they are working with right now, supervising right now. This may be the student their colleague is working with right now. This might be the student they both agree deserves this, whatever, is smarter or whatever, and this is, think of things that 2 people can agree on about, think of some relation like that. And what this is saying is, I'm going to be a set of propositions such that for F1, I'll make sure F1 ends in a student. Every professor is such that he or she recommends whoever they are, whichever individual is the output of F applied to A. So with Professor A, we were looking at F1, the student they are working with right now. F1, and I give A the value, I'll get C. If I get B the value, I'll get D. So you get the variation. This one also you get the variation, a different variation. In this case, you won't get, it's still a functional reading, but you can't just, it might as well have been the individual variable, and same for this. So these 2 are not so interesting. this is where you get the real difference. So you're not giving scope to the quantify over WH or anything. You're still keep interpreting this inside the nucleus, but you're getting variation. Why? Because you change what you were quantifying over. Not just actual students, but students via a function. So far I just left it this way. What Kierkegaard argues is the following. So this is its normal index, right, that we are used to thinking about. This is T sub j, this is which student j. But a scaling function, the semantics of a scaling function suggests that it also has an argument index, right? Because it's a function from individuals to individuals. And this position, this argument can be bound by something that is C commands it. So now we have a function. This is a scaling function that is bound by professor. So it's a function from things that the professor binds to things that student binds, so to say. Okay? So a WH quantifier can leave either a syntactically simple trace or a more complex trace that encodes this dependency. Okay? Everybody is loving this, right? I love it actually. I really think functional answers are cool and this functional approach is cool. Okay. That said, what about subject-object asymmetry? So this works, no problem. This is just like if we are binding any quantifier, you have a, I said every person thinks that he or she should, he or she is such that, every student thinks that he or she is something or the other. You have one trace when you are every student, and then you have a pronoun. That's what this is. What happens if you said which student recommended every professor?
The student is higher from every professor.
Exactly. But so this is no, sorry. So
Traces.
this is now we have moved, right? And this is T sub j, and it has this argument index here. Recommended, and now you have every professor. And this is the I. This is what you're trying to bind. Of course, this is higher, so it can't bind. Because remember, this is going to be now f of x recommended. So recommended f of x x. No, sorry, not yet. Wait. Before I do this. So what we have right now is going to be for the propositions are going to be f of something, y, let's say, which is fine, and then you would have, okay, this is a quantifier, right? So where can we raise the quantifier? We can raise it here. So I'm going to leave behind the trace I. So this is CP, this is C bar, this is TP, right? And this is BP. So where can we raise it? This is one possibility. And if we raise, this is the quantifier itself. So this is where we will have every professor. And now we have created the right C command relation, right? So we should be able to get for all y, Professor y, then recommend y, f of y. No problem, right? So his point though is this configuration is a weak crossover configuration. It's just like saying, who does his mother like? Meaning, who is such that his own mother likes him? So, there's a violation here. So this is no good. Even though it would give us what we wanted. The other option is to do BP adjunction But VP adjunction is going to be the same problem as we had earlier, so you're not going to get, you won't be able to bind this variable. And so you will get for every y, y recommends for all y, Professor Y, and for y whatever, but the universal will be after this, will come after f of y, that's the main issue. So this is contingent, so the explanation for the subject-object case, this is in my book, by the way, if anyone who's interested. It's discussed at great length in chapter 4, and you'll see all the references there. So it looks complicated, but it's actually fairly straightforward in the basic case, the subject-object asymmetry. But that's what Mann is appealing to. He's saying, if you have a trace that is complex, then that trace is somehow, even if you don't believe exactly the story, somehow you have to say that trace has to be C-commanded by the quantifier in the base position. And he's saying the same thing is what we see in the case of these across the board. As long as the individual scalar variables are bound by the subject, that's fine, but not in reverse. Okay? All right. So let me wrap up now, if that works. Okay, so do you have any other questions on this? Okay, so I thought as a way of ending the class, I would go over the things we have looked at in the last 9 days or so, 10 days if you include today. Okay. Does anyone remember? Would anyone like to give me a start? Questions? Not bad. Okay. Is that all we looked at? No, but okay. We started with questions, right? Defining what is a question. And in the process, what did we think about? That question itself is open to discussion. What is a question? Syntactically, it may be one thing. Semantically, we've been looking at different types of questions. Mostly we still talk of questions as set of propositions, but are they multi-membered sets of proposition or single? And the pragmatics, we looked at, I think, a fair amount at the pragmatics of questions. Again, we have this idea that we have a notion of what is a basic, it looks boring, right? From once you start looking at non-canonical questions, but they have a lot of complexity in them. But to think about questions as denoting the set of their direct answers. And we also looked at the issue of questions from a typological perspective. You know, sure, we know a question, every language has to have a way of questioning, I'm assuming. I've heard of languages that don't have multiple WH questions. Italian is supposed to be one such language. I've also seen some people saying that's not quite true, but so Italian is one. Another one, famous one that I even have in one of my papers. Anyway, but no language that lacks questions altogether. I mean, it's a pretty fundamental communicative need, I think. You need it to survive. So we talked about typological perspective on how questions are formed, and that's certainly something we've seen in our own languages. We've looked at morphological variation within noun phrase, within the WH phrase. Anyone remember what those variations might be within the WH phrase? Who, what, for one thing, among other things. So there's morphology. What about if you had a which that is if you had a WH that is a determiner? At least in some languages, you would have the singular plural distinction that you have in regular noun phrases. Then we have talked about the semantics of domain, the domain of quantification. Even now, even on the last day, we kind of couldn't get away from adding or paying more attention to yet another way of quantifying over the what WHS can quantify over. And mind you, I don't think there's a way of getting the facts for functional answers without using functions. So it's not like you could just manage. It's not a luxury. I think it's a need. Anything else that anyone remembers? I'm just going to check off. Please tell me one more thing at least, so I know that you were listening because you made presentations. What else? Something you hadn't thought about before, maybe?
The dealing.
Dealing. So that's you hadn't thought about it before?
No, not that it would have such significance.
So you heard the term.
Yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
the term and that it can be studied.
That's wrong. Why are you not finding it interesting?
That it can be studied.
Yeah, it could just be a given. What is there to Yeah, I think I agree that it can be studied from this perspective. Maybe it's just a basic distinction that we have to make and then it's just vocabulary, right? A way to classify, that's I think what you meant. It's a way to classify these WHs are dealing, these WHs are not. And you might add one or two things to it, but that in fact when you start looking at it, it's more textured than that. That's right. We looked at the notion of information, common ground, what is discourse? And we looked at, of course, something that we knew, and we knew it played a role, but we kind of looked at it from the perspective of using questions. That was a kind of a launching pad, right, for all of these things. Any of these things we could also have studied in other contexts, but I think here we kind of made questions the center of what is like spokes, right, various different things. And so we looked at the common ground as a way of modeling discourse and discourse sensitive phenomena, but we also looked at some